Hello, everyone. My name is Jazib Ishaq, and I will be hosting this lovely podcast with my respectable guests based on the current issues after 7th of October 2023 between the states of Israel and Gaza. Due to the negligence and violence from the international community, the very straightforward issue has become much more of a complex issue in the modern times, and we cannot see any foreseeable future and any solution regarding this issue. Our discussion today will be from a legal perspective, and to discuss those perspectives, we firstly have our honorable guest, Mr. Muneeb Qadir, who is also a human rights activist and also teaches human rights law. Secondly, we have Mr. Hammad Sarwar, who happens to be a lawyer and also an expert on international law. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
And you, sir?
I'm good, Jazib. Thank you for having me on your show.
You're most welcome, sir. It's an honor for us to have you. I would like to thank both of you for joining us today. And before discussing the legalities of what is happening currently between the two states, Israel and Palestine, I would like for you, Sir Hammad, to put a light on a brief history of what happened and what caused this conflict at the first place.
So, Jazib, this conflict, this whole conflict between Israel and Palestine and Gaza, this can be traced back to the early 20th century. This is when Jews were fleeing from Europe. They were fleeing the persecutions at the hands of Nazi Germany. They wanted to establish their own national homeland in Middle East, which was at that time, which was under Ottoman occupation and later came under the occupation of the Britain rule, which we still know as Palestine. So Jews started migrating towards Palestine. They started buying lands, and this eventually erupted in ethnic conflict between Jews and Arab Muslims. So at that time, United Nations General Assembly, they passed a resolution in 1947 in which they divided Israel and Palestine into separate home countries, with Jerusalem as international capital, was a separate state and separate government was going to run Jerusalem. But what happened is that in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, a war started between the Arab countries and Israel. Now, after that war, the West Bank came under the Israeli control. They also controlled Gaza. Jerusalem was divided partially by West Jerusalem was controlled by Israel, and East Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan, and also the West Bank was under Jordanian control. And after the 1967 war, Israel occupied Eastern Jerusalem. They also occupied the West Bank, and they also occupied Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and they also occupied Gaza. After that, there have been many negotiations. We have also seen Oslo Accords, but this fight and this conflict still continues, where Israel still occupies the land, and we have a Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO) in the West Bank, but in Gaza we don't see the Palestinian Authority. We see Hamas, which runs the Gaza Strip. So this is the brief background, but today the situation is quite different as it was in 1948 or in 1967. Today the things have gotten more complex. Like you just pointed out that this was a very easy and simple conflict, but now it's very complicated.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for this extensive and a very brief introduction regarding the issue that is happening right now between the two states. Coming to you, Sir Muneeb, if we can outline the main legal issues between the Israel and Palestinian debate, the occupation, we say, is on the top, right? Can you briefly explain the occupation or annexation of the Palestinian land by Israel and its legal implications with respect to it?
I believe that the legal aspects of this conflict, as they call it, or war, or whatever nomenclature you want to attach, is directly linked to the history and historical background, which Hammad just explained. 1948 particularly was the year of as they say, Nakba, which was when the Israelis or Jewish settlers, they built the settlements, and that too by evacuating people from their lands, by evicting people from their lands, from the territories, and by people I mean the Muslims, the Palestinians, the Arabs. So ever since, more and more settlements are being built. And in very simple language, how could one describe this phenomenon? It's of really throwing people out of their homes. There's no other decent way of putting it, because it's just not a decent thing to do. And that is how demographic change has been affected, or there have been attempts to affect demographic change. Now, how is that related to international law? That is what's important, and that's what I'm going to come to as well. But the Six-Day War in 1967, all these things, which again Hammad did talk about. Ever since, there had been a green line that had been agreed under the auspices of the United Nations, and that has been violated time and again by Israel and by the Israeli forces. And how does Israel justify these acts, and also keeping the international law aspect in light? That again depends on international law. Now, international law, by and large, under Article 2 of the UN Charter, says that use of force is not permitted. Use of force against any other sovereign state. But that's the problem. That Palestine, as of yet, is not a UN member state as such. So it's not given recognition of statehood. But oddly enough, Israel is recognized as a state by the world leaders. And by the world leaders, I again mean to say the ones who wield power on the international stage, and that is the Western world as such. So they have lent their recognition decades ago to Israel. So there's a disparity right there. And also going back to the historical context, around 1917, towards the end of the First World War, Balfour Declaration had been agreed, and the European powers and the Western powers had back then, at the very beginning of the 20th century, agreed that they would recognize a Jewish state on Palestinian lands, because otherwise, the most popular narrative is that before the Nakba, before the Jewish settlements, the Palestinian lands are multi-ethnic, they were multi-faith, multi-religious, and people more or less lived in harmony. But that is not the case currently. So the green line that had been agreed under the auspices of the United Nations, as I said, it has been violated. Force has been used, and all of the settlements which I referred to, they have been built through the sheer use of force itself, on the sheer strength of what is known as the might is right doctrine. So that is what we have been seeing. Now, there is something known as international humanitarian law, and that is what applies, on any international conflict, whether between states, whether between, a state on one hand and non-state actors on the other hand. So Palestine's non-recognition by the international community as a state in its own right doesn't have any bearing on the application of international humanitarian law in this situation. And what directly applies in this situation are the Geneva Conventions, the 4 Geneva Conventions. And to me, the most important ones here are the first Geneva Convention, and the most important, of course, has to be the 4th Geneva Convention, because the 4th Geneva Convention deals with protection that is afforded to civilians during times of international armed conflict. Now, is this an international armed conflict that we see between Israel and Palestine? Number one, a lot of people have issues with the use of the word conflict, because, like I said, the power dynamics are such that there is a huge disparity. Palestine not having the strength of being able to even claim statehood or being recognized as a state by the international community. And on the other hand, you've got Israel, which has the backing of the high and mighty in the power quarters of international community. So given that disparity, even the word conflict is problematic, but I'm still going to go ahead with it, with that caveat that the 4th Geneva Convention particularly affords civilians with certain protections, the most minimal of protections during any time of international conflict. And that when United Nations is engaged with the situation in Israel Palestine, this is an international conflict. So then for Israel to say that the Geneva Conventions don't apply, or that this is not an international conflict, or this is an internal situation for them to deal with, it's not. And going on from there, the 4th Geneva Convention affords civilians with the foreign protections, which are: you cannot displace people.
Yes.
You cannot render them homeless.
Mhm.
You cannot target civilians. You're only limited to military targets. Which means, and then, medical establishments, hospitals, they have special protection status. And also that annexation, I think that's one of the words that you just used.
That's true.
Annexation, particularly Article 47 of the Forced Geneva Convention, Article 49. So Article 49 deals with, forced displacement of people. Is that happening? I'll get to that. And Article 47 talks about annexation, that whenever you forcibly build your own settlements or occupy regions, and then you try to bring in a population change, that is textbook case of annexation. And other words I'm also seeing they are being used here, genocide, which is covered under a separate regime of international law known as Genocide Convention of 1948. Again, in relation to genocide, you could think of it as having certain actus reus and mens rea elements, not strictly speaking, but you could think of it in that way. That when you are bringing about cleansing of a population, sometimes also known as ethnic cleansing, you are exterminating the population, and your intention is also partial or complete destruction of a population based on their race or their religion or their ethnicity or other such lines. That is what amounts to genocide. Now, unfortunately, in the International Court of Justice's previous judgments and decisions, the mental element behind genocide, with the intent of destroying or bringing about destruction of a population, that has proven to be very, very difficult. Even though the Genocide Watch, mind you, has sounded an alarm that what is happening and what has been happening ever since 1948, ever since 1967, in the hands of the Israeli settlers and the Israeli occupying forces towards the Palestinians is genocide. The 10 stages which Genocide Watch has described, and you can check that on their website as well, of when a genocide would be said to be underway, have been completed when it comes to the situation and the dynamics between Israel and Palestine. So the legal context is very wide. But one last thing that I would want to mention before you move on to your next question is that in 2004, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, had rendered an advisory opinion in relation to the wall that had been built by Israel through East Jerusalem, which actually cut Palestinian people away from their own kin and kith, and made them homeless in their own lands. Was that legal or not? This was the question which was put to the ICJ in 2004, and the ICJ unequivocally, categorically stated that the situation was illegal and that the international community was under an obligation not to recognize the illegal situation with the building of that wall through East Jerusalem. But guess what happened after the ICJ came up with its advisory opinion? Israel The Israeli cabinet sat down, they met, and they discussed how to further extend that wall. So there is a sense of impunity with which Israel operates. By impunity, I mean they really believe that they are above the rules and norms of international law. Those rules are just not applicable.
Thank you so much, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what I would call a very extensive and an understandable answer that everyone can relate to. And thank you so much, sir. I would like to come back to Mr. Hammad. What does the international law on self-defense states with regards to the occupation that we just talked about? Do the Palestinians have a right to take up arms to defend their land? I would like to have a take upon.
Yeah, so just like Muneeb mentioned, that we have Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits any sort of use of force in international disputes or conflicts, or any threat of force as well. But we have a couple of exceptions in the UN Charter, and one of the exceptions which is quite famous is Article 51, which is right to self-defense. Now, when we talk about self-defense, there's a lot of question and discussion that can be done on proportionality and necessity. So, coming to your question, yes, if someone's land is occupied, if it is annexed by use of force, they do have a right to defend their lands. They do have a right to armed struggle under UN Charter, under Article 51. Now, whether that right applies to Palestinians or not is the next question. We have seen United Nations General Assembly resolutions that, for example, when Portugal, they colonized Guinea-Bissau, there was a UN General Assembly resolution in 1960s, which condemned Portuguese occupation. And they also said that this resolution also says that the international community, they have an obligation to support the armed struggle of the people who are colonized against the colonizers. And then there are also other UN General Assembly resolutions in 1980s, which also supports this narrative and this legal argument that if someone's land is occupied, or if they're living under, under colonization or under an occupation, those people, they have a right to armed struggle. Now, coming back to your question again, yes, Palestinians do have a right to armed struggle, given the fact that they are under the guidelines of proportionality and necessity, but they don't have a right to indiscriminately target the civilians or kill the civilians in that regard. They only have the right to target the combatants, the military personnel.
Thank you so much, sir. And that clarifies a lot of things for the audience and for me as well. Thank you very much. Coming back to you, sir, to the recent conflict. Sir, can you explain the events of the 7th October 2023? And I think the world knows to know right now.
That is the most challenging, the most difficult thing to do currently, given the polarized state of the world currently,
Yes.
that everyone is peddling their own narratives depending on where they stand. And so there's a lot of this mass disinformation and misinformation available on social media. And it's very important that people, if, as hard as it may be, try to keep a balanced approach and a nuanced approach towards what's going on. So 7th October 2023 is that particular date, which marked, I think, the turning of the tide, at least in relation to the Israel versus Hamas or Israel versus Palestine equation. And it's still ongoing, and the situation is only worsening. And what happened was that this news broke out, and the world started talking about an attack on Israeli lands, on the kibbutz, by the Hamas forces. And now Hamas, by the way, we need to keep international context in mind, and a lot of countries, for example, in the United Kingdom, is designated as a terrorist organization. So the legitimacy part, at least when it comes to the discourse in Western world, is missing when it comes to Hamas. But Israel being recognized as sovereign state, automatically, if the same acts are done by Hamas as have been done by Israel, the language that is used is extremely different, is very different. And that's because the idea of state sovereignty brings with it a certain amount of legitimacy, which, it clouds even illegitimate acts of state with that cover of legitimacy, that because it's state, so what they're doing could be self-defense, or all right, what they're doing is violating international law, but they are still a valid entity. So that status of a valid entity is missing when it comes to Hamas. So when they've done something that Israel has been doing for very long, automatically, the kind of horror that is going to be expressed by the international community is going to be much, much higher. And so the reports suggested that there was a musical festival going on in Israeli territory, in Israeli lands, and also certain residential areas in the kibbutz where mostly civilians are targeted, and between 1,200 to 1,400, figures could be disputed, but at least between 1,200 to 1,400 people, and mostly civilians on Israeli lands, had been killed, and more than 200 people had been taken hostages by Hamas. Now, how accurate are also those social media posts? Because as we've seen, that there was a lot of disinformation which came out that Hamas had been beheading dead babies in their corpses. That had been reported, but then later it was found out that that had not happened. And there have also been images being circulated of women being abused, and being abused in the most improper way by Hamas. And people who are pro-Hamas, they're saying no such thing happened, and that is disinformation. But people who are anti-Hamas, they are testifying to and even citing certain sources, which they say verifies their information, that those videos are accurate and that they are authentic. So on the one hand, we've got this, that pro-Israelis, the first question they ask you is, do you condemn what Hamas did on 7th October? Do you recognize that Hamas is a terrorist organization? So that's one part of the narrative. But a more nuanced approach would also highlight the fact that what Hamas did, and that is exactly what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also said. It just didn't operate, or it just didn't happen out of nowhere or without any context. The context is that years and decades of Israeli occupation and the impunity about which I just talked
Yes, for
in my
sure.
previous response to your question, decades of abuse and building of settlements and Palestinian people being violated, being deprived of their rights and the rights which have been granted in international law and their rights to self-determination. Now that's one interesting phrase which I've used, is self-determination, has resulted in such antagonism that factions have developed on Palestinian lands which have taken on militancy. They have become militant, and yes, Hamas is a militant organization. The kind of language that we're seeing ranges from them being regarded as or described as terrorists, all the way to them being described as a resistance movement by at least people who have sympathies towards Hamas. But as Hamas also, pointed out here, that you cannot target civilians because, interestingly, international humanitarian law entails individual responsibility. So it means that we're not talking about states, we're not talking about Israel, we're not talking about Hamas, we talk about individuals who take up arms against civilians, against unarmed civilians. They automatically incur and they directly incur responsibility under international humanitarian law. So this is something for the UN fact-finding missions and the International Criminal Court to find out how much of the atrocities committed by Hamas, as being told by the Western media and international community, is authentic. Because if they really targeted civilians, then yes, that does incur responsibility under international humanitarian law. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing is that a lot of Western leaders, the European Union, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, if I were to see her, President Emmanuel Macron, and American establishment, or their calendar seems to have been stuck at 7th October 2023, as if that's the only thing that has happened. So their conversation is surrounded, around 7th October. What happened on 7th October? Do you condemn it? Hamas's terrorist attacks, do you condemn it? It's not moving forward. That a lot more happened after 7th October. How about we also mention that to understand what's going on currently? And what happened after 7th October was that Israel found the perfect excuse to unleash their wrath and to unleash their horrors on Palestinian populations, which they had been doing before 7th October anyway. One remembers, if nothing else, then in recent memory, what happened in 2014 when Israel again, launched its attacks and strikes on Gazan civilians. And what even happened in 2021, they also, launched these strikes on, let alone anything else, but media houses as well, on journalists, on Al Jazeera's offices, on civilian residential targets. So you have to understand that they have been doing the same before 7th October. They have now been doing that ever since 7th October because perhaps they found the perfect legitimate excuse. But by doing that, they're only internationalizing the issue more and more. So what they've done after 7th October is that they have issued an ultimatum to whom? To the civilians of Gaza. That you people are supposed to evacuate northern Gaza, move on to southern Gaza, and now just last night they have been throwing leaflets from the air asking people in southern Gaza to also evacuate. Now the question is, where do those civilians go? Because it's all blockaded. And Israel is saying that we're doing this because we have to wipe off and we have to wipe out Hamas. But what kind of revenge is this? Where you are avenging not the military targets that you say that you are avenging, but your revenge is solely and completely and disproportionately targeted at civilians because since 7th October, since 8th October, ever since, Israel went on its retaliatory spree, around 12,000 civilians have died. 2/3 of those dead civilians are women and children. Now, that is not to say that, unarmed men don't deserve the protection of international law, even they do. But just to highlight the horrors, that 2/3 of those are women and children. And Israel is calling it self-defense. The civilian deaths, Israel is calling that collateral damage. Is that self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter? I thought that there is something called the Caroline Principle under international law, which demands that self-defense, yes, can be lawfully exercised under international law, but only keeping within the bounds of proportionality. Killing around 12,000 civilians in response, or 1,400 civilian deaths at least, or 240 people being taken as hostages. Does that seem to be proportionate? Does that seem to be proportionate that most of the casualties have been inflicted on civilians, not Hamas, whom you had been saying were your primary targets? Raises a serious doubt and a huge question mark on the credibility of these self-defense claims or labeling civilians in Gaza as collateral damage. You might call that collateral damage. I might call that collective punishment, if not genocide or ethnic cleansing.
Thank you, sir. And I think that is a very extensive observation that we have right now. And coming back to you, sir, and I actually wanted to extend sir's answer, and I guess you can do that as well for us. Sir Hammad, I would love your opinion on what's your take regarding the invasion of Israel on Gaza. Would you call that a war crime? And would you call that Israel created Hamas because of retaliation? Would you call Hamas being created as a retaliation of what Israel did in the previous times? What would you call that?
So, coming to the latter part of your question, uh, just like Muneeb mentioned, that the clock does not start on 7th of October. There was no Hamas in 1940s and 1950s. Okay? All these terrorist organizations, so-called terrorist organizations, I mean, everyone does not agree with the term terrorism for these organizations. These resistance movements, these armed struggles, they were not there after 1948. These started in 1960s and 70s. There were political representatives of the Palestinians before these organizations. They failed, and then we saw these organizations blooming in Palestine or in different parts of the Middle East. Now, whether Israel's actions after 7th of October, whether they amount to war crimes or not, you see that, just like Muneeb mentioned, that we have more than 11,000 civilians who have died. Around 4,500 of these civilians, they are children, and then they are women, and then they are non-combatants. We have 1 million people who are forcibly displaced from northern Gaza to southern part. This is war crime. Killing combatants, killing non-combatants, killing children and women, this is violation of international humanitarian law. Forced displacement of civilians is also violation of international humanitarian law. Israel has also targeted hospitals. They have targeted civilian buildings. They have also targeted ambulances, and they have also targeted mosques. This is also a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and also according to the Rome Statute 2002. Now, whether this is genocide or not, it is arguable that Israel is committing genocide. However, we need more facts. We need more menziria related to whether this is genocide or not. But it is arguable that this is genocide.
Thank you, sir, for pointing out that it is a war crime under the international law.
Yes.
And coming back to you, sir, it's a very extensive question, and we would love your point of view on that. In 2021, Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And we saw a lot of anger and opposition from the Western countries and their media as well.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, we don't see the same reaction from the media or their government. And to be honest, it's not even close. We also know how CNN reported Israel's, dead babies, and then they recreated that story. So, what's your take on this, sir? Are Western governments and media biased towards Palestine, or are they in favor of Israel?
I mean, isn't it amazing that the EU Commission President, you can even find her tweets, she had been saying when it came to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is still ongoing, that attacking hospitals or civilian places or residential places are war crimes, is now saying that what Israel is doing in Gaza is legitimate self-defense. How exactly? I mean, just as Hammad has also said, Al-Shifa hospital is under siege by the hands of Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, and they have infiltrated the hospital. People who were being treated, they don't have oxygen supplies. Babies have been dying. Less than a year-old babies have been dying for lack of oxygen supplies. And Israel has been claiming, oh no, but this is not a legitimate civilian, protected place. This hospital, because this is where Hamas are hiding, and this is where they're operating from. Flimsy evidence, if there's any evidence at all. They have been sharing video footage, saying that they found weapons there. Now, who knows? The Israeli forces might have planted those weapons themselves. We don't know. Or even if there are weapons there, the UN has categorically stated that that does not deprive Al-Shifa Hospital from the status of a protected place, that it is supported under international humanitarian law, particularly under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the claim that Al-Shifa Hospital is a base for Hamas to operate from a military place, it hasn't been verified by external or independent sources as of now and as of yet. We need to keep that in mind. So when you are targeting hospitals in Ukraine, the international community and Western leaders are going to express their shock and horror, and rightly so, over that, but they wouldn't be doing the same when it comes to Gazan civilians. And mind you, blocking medical supplies and food, again, those are some of the most typical examples of what international humanitarian law violation looks like. And also non-combatants when they are being targeted. When ambulances, Red Cross has reported that their van had been fired just only recently. And under the First Geneva Convention, the ICRC enjoys a special privileged position under international humanitarian law. So when medical aid, when medical workers, when war correspondents, let alone civilians, are being targeted, every single rule in the book of international humanitarian law is being flouted, and is being flouted with impunity. So yes, we are seeing a complete opposite reaction of what we had been seeing in relation to Russia and Ukraine. Because yes, Russian aggression was targeted at Ukrainian civilians. It still is. Ukrainian civilians have been displaced. They are, and that's wholly illegal and flies in the face of international law. But if we are condemning Russia for doing in Ukraine what they have been doing, then why can Israel cannot be condemned? Speaking of Western media, I heard Piers Morgan just 2 nights ago, and he said, well, you cannot compare the situation in Ukraine to the situation in Gaza. Why? Because the aggressor in Ukrainian is Russia, and Ukraine does not have any armed resistance movement within them, but in Gaza there is an armed resistance movement or an internationally designated terrorist organization, Hamas. Yes, but the focus is not on Hamas. What I just said, that it's not Hamas who are suffering. It is Gazan civilians who are suffering.
Yes.
But dehumanization of civilians in Gaza, President Macron of France, he had tweeted that 7th October events have shown the true colors of the people of Gaza. So that is what he did. He blurred the distinction between Gazan civilians, unarmed civilians, and Hamas. And then, the Prime Minister's Office of Israel, just before the strikes on Al-Shifa Hospital, briefly, a few moments before that, had tweeted or posted, now it's called X. So on X, he had written that this is a fight between children of lightness and children of dark. So again, what he meant was that children dying in Gaza are deserving of what is happening to them or what would happen to them. It's as if, he knew what he was going to do. Netanyahu, that's what I'm talking about. And again, human animals is how the Israeli defense minister has described not Hamas, but the people of Gaza. And we are not even, bringing into equation right now, I'm only talking about Gaza, what's been going on in West Bank and how those people have been dehumanized. So when, we see dehumanization, the otherization, so to speak, of a particular population, you are paving the path for all sorts of ethnic cleansing and yes, potentially even genocide. And now this is where the International Criminal Court needs to step in. Because Karim Khan, who is the ICC chief prosecutor, he has himself visited those territories, or at least, on Rafah, the border between Egypt and Gaza, and he certified that war crimes are taking place there. They very much are taking place there. And ICC, interestingly, even has jurisdiction on this conflict because Palestine became a state party to the ICC
Yes.
between 2014 and 2015, which means that anything that happens against Palestinian civilians and anything that happens on Palestinian territories, including Gaza and West Bank, very well come within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So now the ball is literally in their court.
No. I would like to add to it, just Muneeb said that a lot of rhetoric coming from Israel is that all of the people, the civilians in Gaza, they are somehow responsible for what Hamas did. That's why they're legitimizing indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, the killings of the civilians. They're legitimizing it because they believe that Hamas is the true representative of the people of Gaza. That's why you can, kill all these civilians. This collective punishment is also unlawful under Geneva Conventions. It does not authorizes collective punishment for all civilian populations. That is also unlawful.
Thank you so much, both of you. First of all, my condolences and sympathies to the Western media. We just exposed a lot of things right now here, and that's just facts for you. And thank you, sir, for doing that, and thank you, sir, for doing that as well. The last question that I have for today's podcast, and we'll end this on a very good note. Sir, how can we hold Israel accountable if we say so that they're committing war crimes, or based on facts, what they're doing is illegitimate? So how can we hold them accountable for the crimes they have committed since 7th October? Let's talk about 7th October. Let's not go back. Let's just stay on the topic of 7th October 2023.
So there are a couple of options that Palestine can take. First of all, they can bring a claim against Israel in the International Court of Justice for its violation of the Genocide Convention. We have seen this before in Yugoslavia's case, and currently Russia's and Ukraine. They're both in the ICJ as well. Secondly, we can also bring claims in the International Criminal Court, that is individual responsibility against the military leadership or the political leadership of Israel for alleged war crimes or the violations of international humanitarian law. There's a lot of talk about bringing Israel into ICC and their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in front of the International Criminal Court for the war crimes as well. Other than that, we can also set up an ad hoc tribunal. We have seen this before. There was an ad hoc tribunal for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and for some Asian countries as well, for Cambodia as well. Now, ad hoc tribunal, it is sanctioned by the UN General Assembly or the Security Council. And what they do is that they particularly investigate the war crimes that are committed in Gaza after 7th October, if the jurisdiction is limited to just this conflict. Another benefit of the ad hoc tribunal could be, or it could be a precursor to the ad hoc tribunal, is to set up a UN fact-finding commission. Because a lot of debate after 7th of October is around the facts. We don't know what is happening on the ground. A lot of information that we're getting from IDF. Some of the information we're getting from Hamas or the Hamas authority in Gaza. Both of them are not reliable. So we need a UN fact-finding commission. We need to know what's happening on ground. We need to know whether Hamas are using humans, civilians as shields. We need to know what IDF is doing over there. We need to know what happened on 7th October. Then we can talk about legal responsibility of all the perpetrators.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much, sir, as well. I guess this is all for today, and just make sure to follow the RLCP Instagram page for lovely videos like this, and thank you to our respectable guests again for providing us such knowledgeable things about the Western medias as well, and the conflicts, the ongoing conflicts right now in the Israel and the Palestinian states, and to prevent you from being misled from the Western media right now. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, honorable guests.